in Japan that hopefully you can apply wherever you're listening from. I'm JJWalsh, your host in Hiroshima, Japan, and today I'm talking with Ben Fouracre in Tokyo. Thank you so much for joining, Ben.
Thank you. It's pleasure to be here, pleasure to be part of this.
It's wonderful to talk to you. We did a collaborative project recently with ACC Journal, which I think is coming out soon, and talking about sustainability in business. And it was so wonderful as a way to learn about some of the things that you do, hear some of your ideas. And then, of course, I'm very passionate about sustainability. So then to make the connection to this talk show has been wonderful.
Yeah, that was a great opportunity as well. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So you said you've been in Tokyo for 13 years, is that right?
Yes, well, nearly 13 years this September, yes.
And could you tell us a little bit about the kind of work that you do in Tokyo?
Sure. I work for a company called the Berkeley Research Group. We're a business consultancy. Essentially, what we're doing is we're working for companies on risk-related issues. So that may be trying to identify risk, it may be mitigating risk, or it may be responding to risk. So a lot of the work we do, obviously, a lot of the work I do is for Japanese multinationals, and our focus is either on the overseas transactions or their overseas partnerships, or the existing operations they have overseas. And our work is really related to providing information to them, doing investigations, so finding out information that's not readily available, and as I say, identifying risks, whether it be financial, operational, reputational, legal, so that they can make decisions about their business operations or their growth, their expansion. So in a nutshell, that's what we do. But there's obviously many different facets along the way. Some of that's crisis management, some of that's a little bit more about policy and training and so on. But there's a whole range of things we do, but essentially under the kind of umbrella of risk.
Yeah. And do you work mostly with Japanese companies with an international focus, or is your focus based in Tokyo, but working with more Asian countries that do work in Japan, or is it both ways?
Sure. I mean, as a company, we're global, but my role really, I'm based in Japan, so I would say 80% of my clients are Japanese multinationals, and that means that most of the work we do is looking outwards from Japan. So a lot of the work in the emerging markets, but also, it's kind of sector wide. We're very lucky to have a very global team of people that we can draw information from. And there's also work coming into Japan that we're involved with too. So recently there's a lot of activity, especially with private equity firms investing into Japanese assets. And so we provide similar support for them, looking at what those risks may be in the Japanese market.
That's so interesting and important. Yesterday, I was talking with a sustainability consultant in terms of creating sustainable communities, helping people label and be transparent in the apparel industry or different businesses to customers as they're actually doing business. But it seems like a lot of the work that you do is before the products get to the business. So talking about supply chain, thinking a little bit further back to make sure that the business is being run in an ethical way. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a different range of projects that we'll do. The interesting thing when we talk about risk and sustainability is there's a direct link, because many organizations, especially in Japan, are currently going through the process of trying to look at their sustainable agenda. And many companies, many traditional companies, are kind of looking at the next 20 to 30 years and thinking, well, is our company still going to be relevant then? Are we still going to be able to sell or market or produce the same types of products? Is our supply chain viable? Is it sustainable itself? And so I think there's two ways of doing it. There's looking at the very high level overview of where our company is going and what do we need to change. And then there's the much more, much more detailed view of looking specifically at our supply chains perhaps, or our business partnerships, So there's different facets to that in terms of what we look at, but all of it, to be honest, from my perspective, everything relates very closely to the whole sustainability agenda.
Yeah, very interesting. In the article that we were both a part of recently for the American Chamber of Commerce, you were talking about it's not just about like image. It's not just about branding. It's also about survival. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting, and this is a topic I can talk about for forever. But I think when I first started looking at sustainability with companies, one of the things that came up is, and especially if we're looking at supply chain, for instance, traditionally our supply chains have been there for us to, they're our value creation, okay? But traditionally companies have been taught to squeeze supply chains, squeeze the margins, make the costs a lot cheaper for their clients, ultimately who will pay the cost of the supply. But what we're now looking at for a lot of companies, especially when we're looking at adopting sustainability initiatives, is we're actually saying that doesn't actually work anymore. So there was a big question about the current situation and the current way that we understand capitalism. How does that work in the new sustainable environment that we're being asked to operate in? Because instead of being competitive and trying to look at cost cutting, etc., we're talking about investing, and we're talking about creating value and creating helping our supply chains, helping our social and environmental capital. That means we have to invest money. That means we have to think about business in a different way. And one of the professors that I was working with at Oxford University actually said, well, we have to understand the basis of capitalism. So the traditional capitalism, yes, it was about creating revenue and creating payments for our shareholders and so on. It was all about that. But capitalism is changing. If you were to look back into Victorian England, so I'm from Britain, so that's my easy analogy, but Victorian England, and you were running a cotton processing factory, and you had a new cotton processing factory that was set up down the road that was producing cotton a lot faster, you'd probably be saying, well, let's look at how we're going to compete with them. Let's make more use of child labor. And in Victorian England, that would have been perfectly acceptable because children worked in those types of factories. But these days, of course, that would be outrageous for us to suggest that that's what we were going to do. So the goalposts are moving. And I think that one of the fundamental things we have to understand is we have to preserve the environment that we need for doing business. And that means that we have to look at everything from a holistic perspective. It's not just focusing purely on revenue, profitability, product, and so on. We have to take everything into consideration when we're putting our plans together. So for me, that's one of the the fundamental things we have to kind of understand and accept before we start adopting SDGs and initiatives on sustainability. Because going back to the previous slide, you said it's all about what is it we're trying to achieve. What's our purpose, what's our value, and what's our connection to all of these things?
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned child labor, which is such an important consideration in terms of supply chain, it reminded me, looking at this information that you sent to me, thank you, looking at this reminded me of talking with Sophia Mini many years ago, who runs People Tree, and many people who have fair trade clothing shops. And a lot of the key points that they say, even though they started 20 years ago, they always say, our mission, our dream is to not be necessary anymore, that all trade becomes fair. And there is no need for this label of fair trade. But that hasn't happened in so many years. And so the issue of child labor and slavery is still a really important topic to discuss with corporations in terms of compliance for international standards, but also ethics. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think there's different facets to this topic. Child labor and modern slavery are obviously very emotive topics. And we see pictures like on the screen of children working in factories, children picking cotton and so on. And most of us are kind of like, well, how could this happen? But at the same time, we're all drinking our coffee, we're all wearing our T-shirts, and we're not really questioning where this has come from and whether we've made any choices in terms of our buying habits and the decisions about what products we buy and what we make. But I think there's so there is a discussion to be had about those types of things. But the other thing to understand is, why is there child labor? There's many reasons that child labor and modern slavery exists, and obviously it ranges from various different things. There's people trapped in poverty, there's people trapped in debt, there's the kind of economies of the countries that they're living and working in, all the way down to even in Tokyo. You have young girls being coerced into prostitution and pornography. So there's all different things taking place along that kind of line of what we would class as modern slavery and child labor and so on. But I think if you take an example, so a great example is coffee. So when we think about coffee, 80% of coffee is produced from smallholding farms. So these are farmers who we probably never think about when we're drinking our cup of coffee, but they're smallholding farms in countries like Vietnam. Those smallholding farms are on a plantation, and the plantation is owned by someone who runs that particular estate. For them, so they have extremely low wages, if anything, and they often don't get off the plantation. I mean, it's too far for them to travel. They don't get the chance. They're always working, so they have to go to the local estate shop to buy their goods. And the local estate shop is run by the estate. It can charge whatever prices it wants to charge. And so the farmers end up paying more than they can afford, and so they end up in debt. And this has a kind of a long-term cyclic effect, because the family is then trapped in this kind of debt bondage. They can't ever escape from this debt. And so the children are pulled in to do work as well, because what's the point in sending them to have an education? We can't afford it anyway. And so these families, for generations, they're trapped in this cycle. So I think one of the reasons that we're still talking about this is that companies have very correctly looked at fair trade initiatives. But one of the things that we have to understand is that we can't just turn our back on all the other things that are going on. We need to actually find remedies. We need to actually find solutions. So if we're producing coffee, we need to address this poverty cycle that the smallholder farms are existing in, because otherwise it's just a continuous generation by generation effect, and nothing will ever change. So I think that we really need to understand it from that perspective, in terms of why is this happening? What's the economic reason? What's the social reason? And then try to look at how we can perhaps address that going forward.
It's a really complicated issue. Recently, North Korea was in the news because they had a lot of children volunteer to go work in the coal mines. That was the official propaganda, right? So sometimes it's not even just to help your family with necessary income. It's a lot of social pressure and propaganda from the leadership as well. It could be a variety of reasons. But the UN does have, in terms of human rights and protecting children, to give them the right to be children, to go to school, to have time to play. This is part of our international human rights standards, right?
Yeah, so the UN have the Ruggie framework, which is something that's been developed, and it talks about, and again, it's a framework. It's not it's not a black and white requirement. It's a recommendation in terms of what we should understand in terms of our responsibility towards these issues. And it talks about a state's duty. It talks about a corporation's duty in terms of how we approach these things. And so a state's duty is to have these national action plans, these NAPs in place, which talks about their policies on protecting human rights. And then the corporate responsibility talks about an actual corporation putting their own framework in place, their own policies and procedures in place to respect human rights. And then, as you see, then the third part of those United Nations frameworks, which is probably the most interesting part, is a victim's right to access effective remedies. So it essentially means that that's putting the responsibility on corporations and on governments to directly support remedial measures in order to fix these issues. And I think that fundamentally changes the way that companies will respond and will deal with their supply chains, because it's basically now saying, you know, we have a corporate responsibility to deal with this. We can no longer sit back and just, you know, look at cheaper supply and cheaper cost. We're now being asked to actually address things from the bottom up. And I think that that will be one of the key changes. Now, these guiding principles are just that. And often we'll say, you know, that companies have to make money at the end of the day. You know, we can't look at every, you know, we have millions of suppliers all over the world. So we can't possibly visit every single smallholding farm and every single, you know, garment factory. But we do have to put some roadmaps in place in terms of what is it that is important to us as a company, and where are we going to focus our effort, and where are we at least going to start looking at this and addressing this. So I think the UN guiding principles are very important as a kind of a basic framework in terms of what we need to be looking at. But it's just that, I mean, the legislation obviously isn't forcing companies to do this. It's more a question of whether, as a company, we're going to take this ethical responsibility, or whether we're not going to take this ethical responsibility. And, you know, when you look at carbon and, you know, environmental issues related to carbon and so on, it's great that every country is committing to, you know, zero carbon or carbon neutral by 2050, 2045, 2030. It kind of feels like everyone's running off to different planets. And, you know, we're not all going to the same place. And I think it's the same here. You know, there needs to be a lot more discussion and collaboration in terms of how we're going to fix this as a community of businesses, or as a, you know, a community of nations, I guess, in terms of trying to look at some of these issues. Because, you know, as I mentioned, I do a lot of work for Japanese companies, and one Japanese company cannot solve the child labor issue in Vietnam or in Indonesia. It's impossible for them to do that on their own. So there needs to be a lot more thought put into this about how we can approach it as, you know, in a collaborative manner, I think.
Definitely. But if a company is doing something better than compliance, above compliance, this is a chance for good branding, right?
Right.
To convey that message to the consumer. And now I think you've talked about in a few articles how in 2021, after coronavirus, after all of these big scandals of apparel industry and lots of industries not taking care of human rights, that if a company is above compliance and doing things responsibly, that is something that the consumer will react positively to, right?
I think you're right. And we're seeing a lot of changes, not just from consumer behavior. We're also seeing a lot more investor pressure. We're seeing a lot more pressure from banks, financial institutions, about what they're going to fund and what they're not going to fund. We're seeing a lot more pressure from companies looking at doing due diligence on their business partners. So I think that pressure is beginning to move things. So it's interesting. Normally, it's the legislation that moves things, but I think now we're seeing a different kind of pressure being exerted on companies. And there's several reasons for that. I think people are more aware of the issue. And so essentially we're saying to companies, you know, it's great that we're making money, but we can no longer make money out of damaging our social or our environmental capital. So we have to give back. We have to create value for our entire value chain, all of our stakeholders. That's one thing we're looking at. But there is also this pressure from investors that they want to be seen to be investing in, you know, obviously, you know, companies with ESG awareness, social awareness, environmental awareness, and good governance. And I think that what we're beginning to see, especially with a lot of clients in Japan, is that pressure is increasing in terms of the transparency they're being asked to provide on their operations and their processes. And I have to say, Japan is responding to that very well. It's taking it very seriously. But you're right, it's not just consumers, although consumers are also, you know, key to this whole thing. I mean, the question is really, will consumers pay more money for products that they know are going to be, you know, ethically produced? And you know, we're seeing it with the you know, the Xinjiang issue in China and so on, that there's a lot of concern about, you know, as you mentioned, North Korea as well. I mean, you know, are those children volunteering to work in the mines, or are they being cajoled into doing so? And, you know, how are we putting a spin on that? But I think there's a lot more realization from consumers, and I'd also say from employees. So one of the interesting things about Japan, if you look at the next 10, 20, 30 years is the demographics. The population in Japan is decreasing rapidly. And so for us to be able to resource our companies in the future, we're going to need to attract talent from abroad. And the people coming from abroad are going to be judging which companies they're going to work for and selecting them, not just based on their compensation, but also on what they stand for and their kind of ethical position. So I think that's something that's very important to mention too. And interesting, you just put up the picture about the new chief of the Keidenren in Japan, who's actually come out and said, that as a business lobby, we're going to put human rights at the top of our agenda. And I think these types of statements, this type of awareness of the issue is something that's just increasing in the strength in terms of the message that's coming across and that's going out to companies in Japan. So we're in a situation now where anyone who's not discussing this as part of their strategy is already way behind. And the question is, well, then how do we adopt it? What do we do? How does this Ruggie framework mean that we have to operate? What does it mean about the relationships with our stakeholders? So that's the kind of situation I think we're in right now.
That's really interesting, and so nice to see some positive changes and some public statements like this from the head of the business lobby. One of the things that you said in a really interesting article that you did recently, I think it was Nikkei Asia as well, talking about there is something innate in the concept of corporate Japan to take care of society. And I thought that was really interesting. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a broader cultural awareness of Japanese companies existing to contribute to their domestic capital. And if you look at, especially if you look at post-war Japan, so the companies that built themselves up and became global leaders, they were all about existing for the communities they operate in. We have a lot of business groups in Japan, and it's a slightly different approach to what we would have in the West when you look at supply chains and how we support the economies of different markets. We're very much focused on Tokyo, Osaka, perhaps as the major capital centers, but there's many factories and suppliers all over Japan. And if we push them out the market, then that particular part of Japan will be suffering. So companies understand that they need to support, they need to allocate work and opportunities around the country. And I think that Japanese companies have this overall concern that they do exist for the community, for the national community at least. And I think if I look at some of the projects that we've worked on for Japanese companies overseas, so let's take for instance an industrial park in Myanmar. Okay, so when Japan was investing into Tilawa, which is an industrial park in Myanmar, they weren't just going in and thinking, this is an immediate opportunity for us. We can go in, take what we want, and come out again. They were looking at setting up something that could be a benchmark for future reference for further development and building communities around that industrial park. So they weren't just looking at setting up factories. They were looking at, well, how do we actually provide accommodation for people working there? How can we make the transportation systems work? How can we work on efficiency and make sure that everyone benefits from that whole situation? So I think it's a great example of Japanese companies looking at the long-term perspective on their businesses. Now, I think where we are now is we're trying to take that and we're trying to say, well, Japan has a big opportunity now to almost be a world leader in terms of how we coexist with our supply chains. So let's take that sense of responsibility and let's now apply it more broadly in a global way, because obviously Japan relies on many other countries in terms of its supply. So there's opportunities to do that, I think, for Japan. So we're not asking for a huge cultural change. It's just more of the same, but let's develop this and let's build on this. And let's also help other countries, other organizations to understand what our objectives are and how they can also contribute. I think that's also really interesting, because when many people think about Japan and Japanese companies, we have this concept of a job for life. And so this is another example of this kind of community association, traditionally you join a Japanese company and you would never consider leaving. You'd be promoted, they'd restructure, but you would always have a job. And that's also, I think, part of this kind of this domestic social responsibility that Japanese companies feel that they actually have. So I think that's a very interesting part of, particularly for Japanese companies, how they approach their businesses.
And I think that traditional integrity that you're talking about is sometimes lost. Let's talk a little bit about how Japanese corporate structure is comparing to international standards. You had some examples. So the 2020 human rights standards, international standards, and it's not good news, right? It's lagging behind. So is this traditional taking care of society, does that only extend to within Japan, or is the concept that you take care of your workers no matter where they are in the world, no matter what race they are, is that become the modern logic of corporations in Japan? I hope so.
I think we're in that process right now. I think that it's not something you can fix overnight. This is going to take an incredibly long time to understand and to implement. And one of the things we're saying to our clients is, don't expect to just sort of put a policy on your website and then suddenly it's fixed. It's not. It's going to take an incredible amount of time to understand your supply chain and to understand all your third-party stakeholders and understand how you're going to tackle this and so on. So there's two parts to that. Number one, yes, Japanese legislation falls way behind global standards in terms of putting things together on human rights and issues. I mean, we talk about the diversity inclusion issues in Japan as a great example of where it lags behind. And there has been a school of thought, well, if it's not a legal requirement, do we really need to spend money to do this? So I think we have to consider that too. But I think that Japanese companies aren't going out there thinking, what the hell, we will do what we like. They absolutely do not want to break the law. They do not want to upset people. They're all about this, the harmony that we talk about in Japan. And I think that that's something that they are taking very seriously. So we can look at Japanese companies on their human rights standards. And I think that we may be able to apply that to other countries too. It's just that Japan has such a large footprint in other markets, especially in emerging markets where these issues are very prominent. So it's a relatively easy target. But at the same time, it's very hard to penetrate the walls of these big corporations to figure out what exactly is going on inside and what exactly are you talking about when you're putting your strategies together. So I think there's that angle. But I think the other side is, as I said, the complexity of the issue. We can't just go out and fix it. So what we're really recommending to our clients is that you have to kind of do a risk mapping. So where are the key areas that we need to focus? Where's the highest risk? Where's our largest operations? And then as part of that risk mapping, we can prioritize areas that we can focus on. So if we think we can, let's go back to coffee farming in Vietnam, if that's one of our areas of supply, then maybe we can focus on a particular region or a particular aspect of that supply chain in Vietnam and start putting in some measures to take remedial actions and thinking about what we can do. And if there's things we can fix ourselves, that's fantastic. But if not, who do we need to support us? What other people do we need? Where do we need to get information from? And who can we collaborate with and partner with? And as you're showing on the screen, this is from Unilever. I mean, basically putting together their 12 fundamental principles. So this isn't anything that's overtly complex. It's a very simplified version of, look, these are the kind of things that we expect from our suppliers and our business partners. It's really easy to understand. And obviously underneath each one of these 12 things, there's policies and frameworks in place, but it's just a very simple way of saying, this is our starting point. This is step one. And from here, we can then evolve and develop our programs and build out our roadmaps. But at least it's putting your foot in the it's putting your foot in the sand and saying, hey, we're going to stand for this and we're going to move forward from this point. And I think that's really part of the battle. It also, it relates to compliance as well. I often think that a really great comparison for the way this is rolling out is when we look at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So, 4 or 5 years ago, if we were talking about FCPA issues in Japan, it was really still educating people about what is a foreign official, what is a government official, and how do we interact with them, and what is a bribe, and why shouldn't we pay bribes. But now, 5 years later, companies have compliance in place, they have policies in place, they have anti-bribery training. So it doesn't take long for this to roll out and become an established part of our operations. And I think if we take on responsibilities for our supply chains in the same way, I think in 5 years' time, just imagine what changes we could make.
One of the things that I've seen you mention a few times is about leadership. That if you are going above compliance, you're trying to be a more ethical, more sustainable company, you really need to have the top people passionate about what they're doing and have that enthusiasm kind of embed the corporate structure. And I've seen this play out with so many examples of sustainable business. One of the examples I love to use with my marketing students is about Kikkoman soy sauce. And the leader, the head who has now passed on, but his legacy that was so important to him to pass on a sustainable business to his great-great-grandchildren. He was planning generations ahead. He moved operations to America. He still wanted to take care of his American staff. It's a very Japanese company based in heritage and history. He didn't lose that. But there's so many interesting connections to sustainability from his vision and passion to have a great company and a great product for generations. So this whole idea of a long-term vision from the top is so key for any sustainable business. Do you see this in your interactions a lot?
Absolutely. I mean, having the vision is the first thing that we always need to have in place. I mean, if we don't know where we're going, how can we possibly work on our KPIs and our strategy and who we're going to hire and what we're going to decide and what types of products we're going to sell and so on. So I think fundamentally having a very clear and simple and understood vision is key to the whole thing. And there's many company visions. I mean, you can Google different companies and you can see their vision, and a lot of them talk about being the number one in this and the best sort of employer of choice and so on. But a real vision is something that employees and stakeholders will be drawn towards and feel that I can get behind this, and this makes my purpose for getting up in the morning and going to work meaningful because I'm contributing to something that has a meaning, that has a purpose, and has an impact on people's lives. And I think that that's really the type of vision we need to be understanding. So if you don't have, I mean, it's the same story when we're always talking about senior management commitment. If it doesn't start from senior management, then we're already on the back foot. You can't implement these policies from middle management or from the bottom up. It just won't work unless senior management is leading by example and constantly communicating the vision, why we're doing this, why it's important, and why we're making the decisions that we're making. I think those are the things that we really have to have in place to put together a meaningful program, whether it's sustainability, whether it's profitability, whatever it may be. I think those are really key decisions that we need to understand. And I think that in terms of the structure of Japanese corporates, a lot of this is consensus driven. You have your family-owned companies, as you mentioned, where you probably have a single person who can create that vision and can fashion the business in the way they want to. But many corporates are run on a consensus basis. You have a board, you have committees, you have many different elements putting your strategies together. So it's not so straightforward in defining what it is we need to be standing for as a company. Where does that kind of ethical responsibility come into our vision, and how do we communicate that to everyone and keep everybody happy? So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, still on companies understanding what that actually is. And I've worked with many companies all over the world on establishing visions, and I think that the process is often extremely overcomplicated. I think simplifying that vision back down to sort of, military basics. We need to get from A to B. So where are we now? What do we need? And when are we going to arrive at B? So how are we going to put that in place? I think those are the things that we need to really figure out when we're putting these kind of overall visions and purposes together. But that's really one of the things that I think is changing when we look at corporations globally. I mean, you only have to now look on your TV and look at probably 70% of the advertisements you see on television relate somewhat to sustainability, to some kind of ethical purpose. I think things are changing quite rapidly in terms of our perspectives on these things.
A really interesting shift, and I think this relates to what we're talking about with leadership, is you were talking about the shift from CSR, which is just one part of a company that doesn't have much power, to becoming a more ethical business, kind of embedded in core values. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think one of the things to be aware of is it's really easy to do what a lot of people here are calling greenwashing. And I personally don't really like that phrase, but it's easy to throw around. But you have your kind of ESG reporting, and then you have your CSR, and now we have our SDGs. And many companies just putting those SDGs on the website and saying, hey, we're committed. But again, these things are just, the SDGs are just a guideline. They're not a frame, they're not a policy, they're not something that will tell you how to run your business. So I think we have to be really careful about giving meaning to the operations that we're involved in. ESG reporting has become rather commonplace. And many companies in their reporting, they're doing integrated reports, they have ESG standards. You can look on the websites and they're publishing facts and figures. What I find is a lot of that ESG reporting is still based on financial data or quantitative metrics, things that we can measure, things that we can look back and say, hey, we've reduced our carbon emissions by this much, and we've done this much recycling. And if you read all of these ESG reports, you think we don't have to worry about the future of the planet because we've got it sorted out. But I think it's easy to put a to analyze those figures and put a spin on it. CSR is also complicated because where does that fit into things? So companies have suddenly CSR departments, but often those CSR departments, you're right, they don't really have decision-making power. They don't necessarily form part of the overall strategy of the company. It tends to be sort of one-off initiatives that we're doing where we're contributing money, or we're providing education, or we're providing transportation, or something along those lines. And it's really interesting. I recently did a project for a Japanese company who had an issue in Bangladesh. And the issue was that they had communication from an NGO telling them that there was all kinds of human rights abuses and environmental abuses in the work that they were doing in Bangladesh. And they were quite fearful of this message because many NGOs, as they're very emotive, they're very passionate, and they're asking for open communication, they're asking for clarification. And companies know that how you respond to an NGO is very crucial, because the NGO can publish your response, or they can put it anywhere around the world on social media overnight before you have a chance to even figure out, is it actually true? Are these claims valid? So we were helping them, number one, understand the allegations. Are they true? What validity do they have? Have we done an investigation into these allegations? Let's find out what the facts are. And number two, let's find out about the NGO. I mean, are they an NGO we want to collaborate with, want to communicate with, or should we be looking at other NGOs in terms of how we move this forward? Because those types of things you have to put in place before you make your decision about how to proceed. And one of the interesting things we found out was this company were already doing a lot of CSR type initiatives in Bangladesh, but the connection between the CSR department and the team that was running this particular project was very poor, and they weren't really talking about what they were doing, and they weren't really leveraging the CSR initiatives that they were actually involved in. And it was quite interesting to see that they weren't really making that connection. And they were worried about the shareholder meeting coming up, and what if the activists come to the shareholder meeting and start asking questions and make it very difficult for us? And we were saying the same thing. You need to set the agenda. So you need to you need to put this at the forefront of your shareholders meeting. This is what we stand for. This is who we are, and this is what we're doing in other countries, and how we're developing our agenda, our vision, our strategy, our sustainability agenda. Lead that conversation and look at all the positive things you are doing. So it's a long story, but in summary, I think that we really need to understand, what is ESG and what is CSR and what are SDGs and how do they all fit together? And do we really need different departments for all these things, or is it not just all one and the same thing? And who is responsible for these things in our company? Do we have a chief sustainability officer, or is it a chief CSR officer? I mean, who's taking responsibility? Who do they report to? And who pays attention to what they do? So there's many things that I think we need to look at when we're structuring this and giving it meaning within our organizations.
One of the reasons I decided to become a consultant in the tourism and kind of sustainability focused for business industry was to help businesses which are doing sustainable things, good for society, good for planet, but they are not communicating that as part of their brand. So I would, in my research, when I was a university professor, I would go around to different hotels, for example, and talk to staff and find out if they are doing CSR and what are they doing to help society or help the planet. And quite often they were doing amazing things, but they didn't have it on the website. They only had it maybe at the shareholders meeting in a small section just for the shareholders. And so making this connection between doing ethical work, doing good work, doing sustainable work, and communicating that to the customer as part of your brand. I'm still surprised how there's kind of a gap in having that activity, doing good, and not having it as part of your brand. And that seems like a lot of the work that you're doing as well, is to not only help them research the supply chain and find out if they are doing the right thing, but helping them communicate as well. Is that right?
It is, yeah. And I think it's really about how we put all that messaging together and create the impact we want to create. And I think there's a couple of things to mention on that. One is, if we do that effectively, it has a knock-on effect. And you see a wave of people saying, hey, how impactful is that? Let's do the same, and so on. It really is effective. But I think I was having this very discussion earlier this week, and with one particular global brand manager and with one professor from Hitotsubashi University, and we were talking about this as well. I was talking about the same issue, and they were saying, one of the issues we have in Japan is we don't want to be seen to be arrogant. So if we're going out there saying, look at all this great stuff we're doing, we're actually, we're running the risk of being perceived as arrogant. And it is very difficult for Japanese organizations to sort of fly their flag in terms of, how good we're doing on all of these things. If you're a Western organization, it's much easier. I'm not saying that they're all arrogant, but it's much easier to say, look what we're doing all this, and this is, but Japanese companies find it very hard to fly their flag on these issues. They want someone else to notice it and to talk about it, but they won't necessarily think that they can go out there and start preaching about all the great stuff we're doing. So I think that part of the conversation we're having is how you can make that type of communication in a way that's not going to be seen as out of character for a Japanese company, but is also something that we can make sure that people are aware of the contribution we're making and the message that we're trying to give. But it's a very interesting subject when you talk about the kind of the cultural ways of doing business and how we communicate and so on. It's not so easy just to sort of put together a presentation and go out there and do it. However, there is a lot of good, and as you say, I mean, I think the interesting thing about it is most of the companies we're working with understand there is a need to make changes, and we're currently going through that process. But it's very early days. You don't just have a shift in culture overnight. It takes time to do that.
And on the other hand, I should mention there are big companies who are saying they're doing amazing things and not. So that goes back to your point about greenwashing. So that was one of the things that I really wanted to help the small, medium-sized businesses that were doing great things and being so modest about it, but they really should have that as part of their branding because it's very appealing, not just for international customers or visitors, but for domestic customers who are now becoming more aware that these things are important, right?
Yeah, I think one of the I guess one of the complexities we have, especially when we go back to talk about supply chains, is that you'll see a lot of policies now where companies are saying they have human rights policy, and due diligence is very important. They do human rights due diligence on supply chains, and I think to an extent they do try to do that. But many companies, as we've seen from studies done by Harvard Business Review and so on, is that most companies only focus on tier 1 suppliers. So they really have great relationships with the tier 1 suppliers. They probably have all of their policies and processes in place with them. They have good onboarding procedures. But what's lacking is what's happening beyond those tier 1 suppliers. And if you go down further to those tier 4s, that's where we get to those small holding farms in Vietnam, where there's very little incentive to change. There's very little understanding of what sustainable methods of farming are. There's very little, reason for them to do anything other than what they've always done. So I think the onus is really on the companies to expand what they're claiming to be doing, and sort of look a bit further than what's easy for them to fix. And take a bit more, I guess, be a bit more involved in the lower tier suppliers is probably one of the things that I would sort of be concerned that is not taking place right now. And just things like supply chain due diligence. So we do a lot of supply chain due diligence, and that's basically going out and finding out those types of issues. And most of the, I have to say, most of the work we do is more reactive than proactive. In terms of the reason we're asked to do that work is because we've had an NGO approach us, or because one of our investors has asked us, or perhaps we've had a whistleblower who's suggested that there's issues in the supply chain. So that then forces a company to bring someone in to say, go and please have a look and check and see what's happening. But a lot of the time, the companies don't have the resource to do that quite so proactively. So again, it goes back to this risk mapping and prioritization. But I think we have to be very careful about what we're claiming to do, and actually having some meaningful frameworks underneath that are actually operationalized and implemented and understood by the various parties that should be connected and involved in those initiatives. As you're saying, no, I mean, there's a lot of reports, a lot of discussion that's been done about paying lip service to the UN. And as I said before, it's easy to put the SDGs on your website, but there needs to be something underneath that. Again, it goes back to the United Nations principles about being part of the solution and addressing the solution. I find it very interesting that if you look at a lot of the larger retail suppliers, they will have scorecards with their suppliers that focus on, they're going to cut carbon by 3%, and they're going to recycle 100% of their plastics and so on. These things are really quite straightforward in terms of tracking and putting some figures around and implementing. And if you want to continue supplying, the major supermarket brand, you will comply. But what happens below those tier 1 suppliers is where it gets really interesting, and that's what you're showing now, is the alternative view about what level of suffering there is in the products that we're consuming, and that's really taking place beyond the scope of what many companies are focused on right now. And going back to the legislation, so there's a lot of talk in the EU right now about mandatory human rights due diligence, and I think that's also something that Japanese companies certainly are paying a lot of attention to. If that type of legislation is implemented, then that will change our entire relationship with our suppliers, because it essentially means that we'll have to put reporting mechanisms in place so that someone in a tier 4 supplier can make a claim against the company at the very top of that supply chain. So putting CSR agreements into our supply chain contracts, doing human rights due diligence, doing social audits, and having much more visibility on our lower tier suppliers is going to be something that I think we need to be implementing it over the next few years to get this right.
Yeah,
Because
and
I think that legislation is coming.
you talked about one of the key components, and I think it's here in your due diligence chart from the OECD as well, about talking to stakeholders. And this is such a key concept, talking to not only your staff and getting ideas about wastage or social problems or work problems, but also having a hotline. I found that really interesting. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a story. So a few years ago, probably about 8 years ago, I was working for a company. I was doing some work for a German company that had a factory in southern Thailand. And the factory in southern Thailand needed 1,500 people a day to run the factory. And the work wasn't particularly skilled. It just needed people to be on a production line doing a purpose. And I spent about 2 months with this factory. And I remember in the mornings standing on the factory gates with the general manager of the factory, who was a Western guy who was standing on the gates. And I sort of said, you're always on the gate every morning. What are you doing? And he said, well, I'm counting the number of workers and I'm observing the workers coming through the gate, because I'm trying to figure out that one looks like they're only 12 years old. And that person there doesn't look particularly healthy, and that person's got bruise on their face and so on. And it suddenly dawned on me that the company doesn't interview each worker. They rely on third parties to bring X number of workers to the factory every day. And in southern Thailand, there's no loyalty. If a factory down the road is offering a slightly higher wage, everyone will just go to that factory. So the relationships we have with the resource working in our supply chains is very different to what we'd expect in Japan or in the US and so on. We have very little transparency and visibility about who's turning up to work. So I think that that is one of the kind of eye-openers in terms of how companies need to understand supply chains and figure out what the actual issue is and what the challenge is in terms of dealing with that. So putting in those those policies, those expectations in terms of what we want from our supply chains isn't quite so simple as just sending out a policy and a manual and saying, and a questionnaire and saying, yoroshiku onegaishimasu, please comply with this. It's more than that. When you go to Southern Asian countries like Indonesia, like Thailand, you need to speak to the communities where the factories are based, because they know the situation. They know what the issues are. They know who's turning up to work at that factory. They know who the third party agents are. And to get a good amount of context from the stakeholders that are involved in not just that community, but also the local governments, the regulators, the other contractors, the other factories. You really need to have a good picture of what's going on before you can actually start thinking about, well, what can we do to protect ourselves and also protect our workforce? So I think that's part of what we would call the due diligence, or the social audit that companies need to start thinking about how they're going to undertake that type of exercise so that they get a better picture of what's actually going on.
That's so important. And especially as Japan's labor is diminishing and the population is going down, these global labor considerations are going to be more and more important going forward, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's the same as, we've seen, as I've said before, we've seen it with anti-corruption. Many of the governments in emerging markets have very high anti-corruption standards, and at the top level, it's there's investigations taking place and all sorts of things going on. But still, corruption is endemic in those countries, and it's not easy to weed out corruption. It's the same with human rights issues. We still have human rights issues in globalized economies, Western world. We're still talking about abuse of workers, sexual abuse, all sorts of things, power harassment in companies in Japan. So there's different manifestations of that. But yeah, I think that going forward, we're going to see a lot more focus on the actual human rights. And again, the fundamental thing that we want people to invest in our country. We want the foreign investment coming in, but we don't want you to be making money out of damaging either the social or the environmental capital that you're taking your supply from. you have to be providing value. You have to be putting something back, or at least creating some kind of sustainability in the society, or in the communities you're operating in.
Yeah, the whole concept of doing business in a way that's not exploitative, right?
Mm,
That you don't want to exploit the workers, you don't want to exploit the environment while you're making your products that you want to sell. And it's a multi-consideration discussion, right? It's not just
right.
black and white. This is the way it's got to be for every country, for every situation. In so many connections to sustainability and all these talks in the series, you realize it's really case by case, and you have to take the information available, keep researching, keep discussing, keep making targets. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. You're never going to get there and finish, okay, we're done, right? It's a continual process. Is that what you see as
Yeah,
well?
absolutely. It's an evolution. And I think that the great thing about what I really enjoy about my job. I mean, we look at risks, so we look at a lot of all the bad stuff, and that can be pretty emotional at sometimes when you see what's going on. But at the same time, what we are doing is we're providing information for companies, and it's information that's not necessarily easy to get. You can't just Google supply chain in Vietnam and find out what's going on with your supplier. Some of these suppliers aren't even necessarily registered, so it's difficult to get that information. So allowing companies access to the information they need is crucial. And then, as I said, creating a roadmap. So, number one, what is it we're trying to achieve? What is our objective here? What can we do feasibly, and where do we need help? And putting that kind of roadmap in place in terms of where our focus is going to be and what we're going to stand for is crucial. And the rest will evolve from that process. But I think you have to start somewhere, and it does take time. But I would also say that there's a lot of, I mean, you mentioned it before. You've spoken to many people in this area. You've worked with many companies who are doing very good things. Collaboration and discussion and forming consortiums is also a crucial part of this. So reaching out to other companies and saying, hey, we've got a problem. How do you deal with this? Can we learn from you? Those are the types of things we can do. NGOs are also a very good source of information and can be very good allies. You need to be selective about which ones you use, and you need to be a bit careful about vetting them and doing your due diligence on them. But the ones that are very effective really know what they're doing. They can't run a business for you, but they will give you a lot of information and a lot of guidance about what the issues are and how they can possibly be resolved. So collaboration, I think, is the buzzword for this.
And it takes a village. It really does, right? Having third-party certification systems in place, having good levels of compliance from government regulation, having NPOs or NGOs who are kind of watchdogs from the outside, having anonymous tip lines. It's complex, and it has to get your information from a variety of stakeholders to really make it work effectively, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's where you need to understand who your resources would be in terms of how you get that information. But I think any business that would be setting up today would have that very much at the forefront of their agenda. I think the issue we have is really sort of taking the long-standing businesses and who are going through that process of readdressing what they're going to look like in 10 years' time, in line with the expectations of investors, consumers, stakeholders, employees, and trying to kind of figure out how we're going to move this great big juggernaut and that's been going down the highway and sort of move it in a different direction, or at least sort of adjust the way that it's been operating. So I think those are the conversations that I think that companies need to be having right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was a really insightful conversation. I learned so much, and it's so important to keep having these discussions and keep helping businesses find the right path to ethics and sustainability, not only for the society's sake in Japan and abroad, but for their own sake and their own survival, like you said, to be resilient over the long term and be a successful company.
Yeah. Well, Joy, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you ever so much. Really appreciate speaking to you this morning.
It's wonderful. If people want to reach out and get in touch with you, what's the best way?
The best way is by, well, you can link to me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way rather than sending out my email address. But otherwise, yeah, I'm very happy to have discussions, take questions. But yeah, you'll find me on LinkedIn. And that's probably the easiest and most effective way to get me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank
you, everybody, for joining today. And tomorrow, 5 p.m., we're talking with Jeremy Phillips, who is remodeling an old Japanese house and retaining some things, making it comfortable in other ways. So Akiya Remodeling tomorrow, 5 p.m. Please join us then. Thank you so much, Ben. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.